Now that we're well into Unit 2, whose theme is learning to express one's daily, weekly, or monthly routine, and you've already learned the 13 verbs that typify activities one might frequently do in the course of a day, starting with se réveiller and ending with se coucher. The next element you need in order to situate chronologically these activities is time, is the ability to express time. That is to say, telling what time it is or telling at what time an activity takes place. And so as we get into expressing time in French, I just want to say that it's not necessarily a difficult task to learn, but there's a lot to convey for one simple reason. The French have an option as to how they want to express time, either on a 12-hour basis or on a 24-hour basis. That is to say, they can either say it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon or it's 13 o'clock. Both expressions are valid. Even the 13 o'clock is actually more frequent. And so there's a lot to explain, but it's not necessarily difficult. So I hope you'll not feel overwhelmed by it. Here we go. Let's get into telling time in French. Here you see the first thing you need to know, which is how to say it is. When you're telling time, you're telling what time of day it is. And that's il est. Il est. Literally, it's it is. It has the same sound as he is, but it's it is in this case. Il est. And then you have the number, which you know, trois. Now in English, if we want to say it's 3 o'clock, for example, or 4 o'clock, or 5 o'clock, we can drop the o'clock and just say it's 3, it's 4, it's 5. In French, the word which corresponds to o'clock, which is heure, heure being the word for hour, it cannot be dropped from the expression. It must follow the number which indicates what hour of the day it is. And so you must say il est 3 heures, il est 4 heures, il est 5 heures. In this case, here on the screen, it's il est 3 heures. Now, if I want to clarify that I'm talking 3 o'clock a.m. as opposed to 3 o'clock p.m., there are two ways to do that. In French, it would be du matin. Il est 3 heures du matin, which has a sense of in the morning. If I was speaking about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I could say il est 15 heures. It's 15 o'clock. And therefore, it would be very clear. There's no possibility of misunderstanding as to whether I was speaking about 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. When you're speaking about 3 a.m. in French, there are two ways you can say it. You can say il est 3 heures, period. It's 3 o'clock. And by the context of what you're saying, you would obviously be speaking about 3 o'clock in the morning. Or you could say il est 3 heures if you really want to clarify du matin, in the morning. And that means you can also say il est 5 heures or il est 5 heures du matin. Or as you see here, il est 7 heures. Il est 7 heures du matin. Il est 9 heures. Il est 11 heures. Il est 11 heures. And I can throw in the du matin if I need to clarify. Now with 11 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 9 o'clock, yes, there's a good chance you might need to clarify because many things can happen at 7 a.m. or 7 p.m., 9 a.m. or 9 p.m. And so there the du matin or de l'après-midi, which is in the afternoon, or du soir, in the evening, can be a necessary expression. So here we have, it's 7 o'clock, as you see, a.m., and therefore, il est 7 heures du matin, or just il est 7 heures, if your listener already knows you're talking about the morning time. Let's move on past into the afternoon hours. You see the expression changes. It was du matin, now it's de l'après-midi. Il est, in this case, il est 2 heures de l'après-midi. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, as I was explaining, there are two ways to express this. To get across the idea that it's 2 p.m., I can go ahead and say the longer expression, de l'après-midi, in the afternoon, and the person will know it's 2 p.m. However, an easier, faster way, which probably explains why it's more common in France, is to say il est 14 heures. You know, 14 is the number 14. It's 14 o'clock. Il est 14 heures. And as odd as that sounds to an American ear, to an English-speaking ear, that is totally normal to a French person. It's very comprehensible. Il est 14 heures, and it's much more rapid, much more efficient, you might say. So if it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you can say il est 4 heures de l'après-midi. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Or you can say, let me see if you can figure it out. How would you get across the idea it's 4 o'clock p.m. without saying de l'après-midi, but making it clear that it's p.m. and not a.m.? Right. In essence, what you have to do is when you're creating the time, you're saying the time, you have to, in your mind, add 12 hours, because those 12 morning hours, to the number, which we normally think of as 4. And so therefore it's 16 o'clock. Il est 16 heures. Il est 16 heures is what you should have said. By the way, when you're listening to someone speak to you using that system, the 24-hour system, and they say il est 16 heures, rather than adding 12 hours, you have to subtract, if you want to think in that fashion, subtract 12 hours from what they said in order to get that 4 in your mind, which English-speaking people are so dependent upon. You'll find that the longer you live in a French-speaking country, however, that no longer becomes necessary. You don't need to go backwards in your thinking to the system that you grew up with. Il est 16 heures, you know that means it's mid-afternoon. You know exactly what that time corresponds to. Let's move on now. Now you see the expression at the bottom here has changed. It was de l'après-midi, now it's du soir, which means in the evening. Il est 6 heures du soir, one can say, to differentiate between 6 heures du matin, which would be 6 a.m., from 6 heures du soir, which is 6 p.m. Of course, you can also say it's 18 o'clock, and that's far more common. Il est 18 heures. That's much faster to say. Il est 18 heures. Which means you can also say il est, in this case, il est 20 heures. I should have let you do that, but il est 20 heures. It's 20 o'clock. Oh, excuse me, it's not 8 o'clock. I didn't look at my screen here. It's actually 10 o'clock in the evening. I skipped 8 o'clock. So I'll let you say this. How would you get across the idea that it's 10 p.m. without saying du soir, which means in the evening? In other words, use the 24-hour system. Okay, hopefully you said il est 22 heures. If you needed to make the mental calculation, you simply added 12 hours to the 10, and that gave you 22 o'clock. Il est 22 heures, or il est 10 heures du soir. Okay, let's push on. Now we come to 12 o'clock, noon, or 12 o'clock, midnight. And there are a couple ways to express these as well. The very common expressions, because they're also brief and therefore they're succinct, they're efficient. For noon would be midi. Il est midi. Il est midi. And for midnight, it's minuit, which means, by the way, minuit is literally what it means in English too, midnight. Nuit is night. Mi means halfway through. And so, il est minuit. One could say, and I'm not sure if I heard this during my years living in France, il est 0 heure, for it's 0 o'clock, because midnight is when the time starts over again. It's 0. And so I don't think I remember hearing that said. If you were to go into a train station, for example, any place where you'd see a schedule, let's say the train was going to leave at 12:05 a.m., 5 minutes after midnight. It would read 00 for the hours, and then an H, which is the letter that corresponds to our colon. And the H corresponds to the word which starts with an H. It would be 00H, then 05 for 5 minutes after midnight. So 00 colon, I'm sorry, 00H05. Let's move on. Now, what if you're not dealing with exactly one of the hours of the day, like 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, but you're dealing with a certain amount of minutes after the hour or two the next hour? This is how you express it. Il est 7 heures. Now you see a plus sign. I'm adding these bits of information together for you, but there's no word said in French corresponding to that word and there when you're talking about time. You just say il est 7h05. That's all you need to say. Il est 7h05. Il est 7h10, therefore. Let's see if you can do this yourself. What would you say here? First say the amount of hours, and then the word heure, which is hours, and then the number corresponding to the minutes after the hour. Okay, hopefully you said il est 7h25. By the way, looking at the picture, you can see it's AM, and so you could say il est 7h25 du matin. But if you're telling the time to somebody, and if they're conscious, you assume that they know it's the morning. You probably don't need to say du matin. Il est 7h25. Okay? Next. Now, there are certain expressions used commonly in English, or in any language really, probably, certainly in French, which simplify the task, or which I don't know if they simplify the task, but they're very commonly used. And those would be quarter and half for a quarter past a certain time of day or hour of the day, and a half past that time of the day. The word for quarter in French is quart, pronounced just like, it sounds like the word car in English, pronounced in a French fashion with the R down your throat. Quart. And you say and a quarter. And so it's et quart. Therefore, when you want to say it's 7:15, you can say either il est 7h15 for it's 7 o'clock 15, il est 7h15, 7:15, or il est 7h et, and here you have to say the word and. You can see I've written it down here. Il est 7h et quart, for it's 7 o'clock and a quarter. In other words, quarter past 7. Il est 7h et quart. And the other word which is frequently used, of course, is demi, meaning a half. So a half past 7 would be il est 7h et demi. Il est 7h et demi. Voilà, voilà, voilà. And of course, again, because the morning you could say du matin, but probably that's not necessary. Now, what if you're dealing with numbers or minutes to the next hour? As soon as you pass the 6 with a minute hand and you're moving toward the next hour, and therefore in English we could say, for example, it's, in this case, it's 10 minutes to 9. What you're going to do, just like I do in English, is you're going to jump ahead to the next hour and say 9. It's 9 o'clock. And you might hesitate and say, wait a minute, it's not 9 o'clock. No, it's not 9 o'clock, but we're going to start with that as the frame of reference, the next hour, because we're closest to that new hour. And then we're going to subtract from it the quantity of minutes that remain until you reach that time. Just like we do in English. We say it's 10 to 9. In French, they say, il est 9h moins 10. Now, the word moins corresponds to this little symbol you see right there, which is minus, moins. Il est 9h moins 10. It's 9 o'clock minus 10, which is, of course, is 8:50. Il est 9h moins 10. Now, il est 9h moins 10 really falls within that 12-hour system, 12-hour way of speaking when you're talking about time. If you're thinking on the level of the 24-hour system, you can also say this, just like we do in English. We can say 8:50. You can say il est 8h50. Just saying the digits, just saying the numbers without going through all these mental calculations required by 9 o'clock minus 10, 9h moins 10. You can simply say il est 8h50. So even here you have an option as to how the time can be said. Il est 9h moins 5, 9 o'clock minus 5, which of course is 8:55. You can say il est 9h moins 5, or again, thinking on that 24-hour system, we're just using digits, just saying numbers. You're not going through any kind of calculations in your mind. Il est 8h55. Il est 8h55, 8:55. Voilà, voilà, voilà. Next, this time I'll let you do it. Say this first, going through this calculation in your mind that you must perform in order to get across the idea of 20 minutes to 10, 20 to the next hour. How would you say that? Okay, hopefully you started off with il est. That's the standard beginning for any time expression, il est. And then you say the amount of hours of the next hour you're closest to, since your minute hand is past the 6, you're moving toward the next hour. So you say il est 10 heures, and then minus 20. You're 20 minutes away from getting there. Il est 10 heures moins 20 is what you should have said. Il est 10 heures moins 20. Now just switch over to the 24-hour system or way of saying things, and just tell me it's 9:40. Let me hear you. Okay, you should have said il est 9h40. Il est 9h40. Don't forget the heure. Whether you're using the 12-hour system, the 24-hour system, the word heure, which roughly corresponds to o'clock, has to always be said. Okay, and now here we have the word quarter. Notice a slight change here. When you're talking about a quarter after an hour, we say écart and a quarter. When you're saying a quarter to the next hour, unfortunately, the French not only have the word moins, which is minus, because you're at 10 o'clock minus a quarter, but they throw in the definite article le. It's moins le quart. So il est 10 heures moins le quart. Il est 10 heures moins le quart. Not just quart, but le quart, when it's a quarter to the next hour. And then what's a simpler way of doing it? Just in the 24-hour system. Il est. Go ahead, say it. Yeah, just saying the numbers such as they exist. Il est 9h45. Il est 9h45. Okay. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about how to express time as when you're indicating what time it is. What time it would be as you look at your watch or your cell phone or whatever means you're using to tell time. Now, because we're dealing with one's daily routine, we want to take that information about expressing time and insert it into a structure which allows us to say that something happens at a certain time. And this idea of at is the word you see at the top of your screen, which is ah. So for example, let's see, 7 o'clock in the morning. What happens at 7 o'clock? Well, maybe you wake up. Very good possibility. So I'll say I wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'll start off with the subject, je. And then remember the verb is se réveiller. You don't say je se, do you? You say je me réveille. Je me réveille. Now I indicate at a certain time. Ah. And now just say the time. 7 heures. Je me réveille à 7 heures. Okay. Now again, you could say du matin in the morning, but I think it's probably, unless you're working night shift, it's probably pretty obvious that you're waking up at 7 o'clock in the morning. That du matin is probably not going to be necessary. If you want to talk about noon or midnight, you're going to say, for example, what happens at midnight? You're probably sleeping. Je dors, and let's say you return home at midnight, or I return home at midnight. Je retourne à la maison à minuit. So here's midnight over here. Je retourne à la maison à minuit. How about at noon? Noon, you might have lunch. Je prends le déjeuner à midi. Je prends le déjeuner à midi. Voilà. Okay. Well, that's it. The biggest challenge you're going to face, undoubtedly, is going to be just listening to people speak to you using the 24-hour system when they're speaking and deciphering what the 18 heures is at 6 o'clock in the evening. But when I said that just now, I didn't have to stop. I just pictured in my head the dinner time, and I said 18 heures. Because I lived in France for a long time, so I don't need to stop and think, okay, 18 o'clock minus 12 is 6 o'clock p.m. No, you'll find that as time goes by and the more and more you use the system, you don't have to go through those mental calculations. Okay, time for you now to get into lesson 2.15, to work with time and to start to integrate time into your daily routine expressions. Au revoir.